Have you ever wondered if science can explain spirituality and how various spiritual practices work? Does spirituality fix human problems? Why all human cultures have developed spiritual practices? How science explains the enlightened states that are reported by some spiritual paths. Dr. Frank Heile will suggest credible scientific answers to all of these questions and more. Dr. Heile has undergraduate and graduate degrees in physics from MIT and Stanford and considers himself to be an atheist. He has been interested in both consciousness and spirituality for at least 35 years. He is writing a book with a tentative title of Spirituality Explained. This forthcoming book describes a three-agent model of consciousness that explains spirituality and non-dual enlightenment. These ideas are completely scientific, so there are no spirits in this explanation of spirituality. In addition to studying neuroscience, psychology, and cognitive science, he has also explored many spiritual paths and practices that have contributed to the development of this model. So welcome today, Dr. Frank Heile.
Start again. My name is Frank Heile, and you just heard all about me. I don't know if I can add anything to that. In fact, I'll skip this next slide because you just said everything that's on that slide. So the outline of this presentation is that there'll be three parts to the presentation, and you can see them here. And I'll talk about spirituality, but before I can talk about spirituality, I need to define spirituality. And I have an equation for that. My equation is spirituality equals religion minus dogma. An example of dogma would be any religion that says this book here is the truth and you must believe it. That's dogma. Subtract that from that religion. And besides that kind of dogma, religion also has things like they're either theistic or non-theistic religions. There are both kinds. They have a number of cultivate a number of positive values, and they use various spiritual practices to try to achieve those values. So another example of dogma would be anything that the religion says about their God. If they say God created the universe, God does this, God does that, subtract that out away from what the religion says. And hopefully what you're left with is the spirituality, which I'll be talking about here today. So, and I'll explain all of these and also why and how spiritual practices work. Now, my main hypothesis is that spirituality began around 40,000 to 100,000 years ago when human consciousness changed. How did human consciousness change? Well, consider that the modern human really lives in two different worlds. We live in the sensory world presented by our senses, and then we live in a conceptual world that's indicated by symbols and words of language. So there's two different worlds that we live in. Whereas ancient humans and animals lived essentially in only one world, which is the sensory world. The world where they can sense what's going on in the world and things like that. For example, chimpanzees in the wild have about 30 call signs that they give to each other. So you could say that their language has about 30 words in it. And that's all they have. So they're mostly living in the sensory world. Now, the human conceptual world is much richer than the sensory world. For example, modern English has about 1 million words in the language right now. But a concept doesn't have to be a single word. A concept can be a phrase or it can be a whole paragraph. It doesn't have to be just one simple word. Another example is that there have been about 50 million scholarly articles published since the 1600s when they started publishing scholarly articles. So if you consider each of those scholarly articles to have, say, 10 new concepts that get introduced, that means there are 500 million concepts introduced in the scientific literature. And that's growing rapidly each day, each year. In addition, you could add all the concepts that exist in all the law books and all the concepts in technology. You know, science, software engineering, hardware engineering, all that kind of stuff. All creates lots and lots of concepts that they use in their work. So you'd have to add all those concepts into the total number of concepts. And finally, add all the concepts that are created in works of fiction. They create concepts there too. So I claim that overall, humanity must have created significantly more than 1 billion concepts so far in its lifetime. Now, no one human is aware of all those billion concepts. We only have our little subset that we work with. But the overlapping subsets add up to all the concepts that humans have created. Now, the great majority of those concepts do not describe objects in the physical sensory world. They are abstract concepts. They are not concrete concepts. So the question is, when did we cross over the threshold from mostly living in the world presented by our senses to mostly living in the world of concepts? And my hypothesis is that we crossed that threshold around the time of the development of behavioral modernity. Now, behavioral modernity developed around 40 to 100,000 years ago, and it includes all these traits here. So this is, by the way, this is a relatively rapid transition, which I'll demonstrate on the next slide, compared to the slow behavioral trait evolution before this time. So to get a sampling of behavioral traits, I went to the Smithsonian's fact sheet on milestones in human evolution. They had 39 traits listed there. 5 of them were anatomical traits, like changed knee joints and hip joints, things like that. 5 were related to migration to different continents, and 5 were about other species becoming extinct. So that left 24 behavioral traits, and here's the first 12 of those 24 behavioral traits. So I want to point out a few of them. At about 1.6 million years ago, we developed a hand axe. A hand axe is simply a rock that you hold in your hand that has like a pointed edge or a sharp edge that you can use to break things or cut things. So, but we had started making tools about 1 million years before that, but it took us 1 million years to come up with the hand axe. And the hand axe persisted for another 1.2 million years. So we weren't making great technological progress back then. Finally, around 500,000 years ago, our brain had expanded to approximately the modern human brain size. So we basically had the same brain 500,000 years ago that we have now. And at 200,000 years ago, we were anatomically modern. If a man from 200,000 years ago appeared here, he might look a little strange, but he would fit in. He would be the same as us. So the question is, why, if we had this modern brain at that time, why did it take so long for those behavioral modernity traits to arrive? And here's the last 12 of the 24 items on the list. And these are the 4 items that occurred during that range from 40 to 100,000 years ago. Notice, for example, burial of the dead. That could be an indication of a religion at that time. And the same thing for figurines. If they were praying to the god of fertility, that could be another indication of religion. So, I think there's indications that religion could have been forming around this time. And then finally, I'll end this whole list at about 5,000 years ago, because if we included all the significant milestones from then to now, this talk would go on forever. There have been a huge number of milestones in the last 5,000 years. So if you plot all these on a time plot, you get something like this. And you notice that it took a long time for the first few traits to happen, but in the last 40 to 100,000 years, they were coming fast and furious. So I claim that there's well, first of all, to make a better understanding of this, let's put it on a log scale instead of a linear time scale. And on a log scale, it looks like this. Now, this is approximately a straight line, so it's really some kind of a logarithmic or exponential takeoff occurring around 40,000 to 100,000 years ago. Now, clearly, behavioral traits hit some kind of an exponential takeoff around 40,000 to 100,000 years ago, and language must have also had an exponential takeoff. Because, for example, presumably 6 million years ago, we started with about the same number of concepts that chimpanzees have, which is about 30 concepts. So we had 30 concepts 6 million years ago, and now we have 1 million English words. So if you tried to put that onto the same plot with a linear axis here, it doesn't make any sense to do this. These early humans would have 200,000 words in their vocabulary, and yet they're only making simple stone tools. So it doesn't make any sense to do that. And continuing, we'll look at some of the other traits about modern humans. The average modern human has about a 10,000 word working vocabulary. And you can add more to that, but you have 10,000 words that you really know and you can use. In addition, only about 2,000 words cover about 80% of modern language usage. So somewhere in that 2,000 to 10,000 range is kind of an indication of modern human language usage. Keep that number in mind. Again, going back to as a model for this behavior, the vocabulary expansion with time, let's start with a model that starts with 30 words at 6 million years ago, and it ends with something less than 1 million words at 5,000 years ago. And a logarithmic word count scale could be achieved for this model if we increase the size of the vocabulary by a factor of 1.5 at each of the new behavioral traits. So going back to the original plot that we have, the idea is at each of these behavioral traits here, you increase the vocabulary by a factor of 1.5. What that does is that converts this linear scale here into a logarithmic scale. And the numbers that I quoted you before give you this kind of a logarithmic scale. So on this scale here, we started at 30 words at 6 million years ago. We ended at about 250,000 words at 5,000 years ago, and that's on line with going to the modern language vocabulary size. And behavioral modernity occurred right here. Now, during that time of the behavioral modernity, 40 to 100,000 years ago, the vocabulary grew from about 4,000 words to 15,000 words, according to this model. So that puts those humans right in the average modern human vocabulary range. So these were probably close to average modern humans. They just didn't have all the technology that we've built up. Now, this is obviously just a model, but I think it suggests that we approach modern humanity around the time of behavioral modernity in terms of our language ability. Now, another question I have is, how did who we are change when our consciousness changed? Now, ancient humans would have identified totally with the body. I am this body. That's what an animal must think, if he's thinking. Whereas modern humans identify with their autobiographical self or their narrative self. And that includes things like my name, my narrative history, my desires and goals, my accomplishments, my future plans, my friends and family, etc. I'll call this the I, me, my concept. That's an abstract concept, and I combine the words I, me, my because any one of those pronouns refer to this concept. So this is a very complex concept in modern human. Now, the conceptual world gave us many, the modern technology that we experience in society, and it was obviously very useful. However, it also caused a living problem, especially this I, me, my concept. That causes a big problem. And spirituality is the cure for that problem. Now, I'll be talking about these 2 points in the third part of this talk. So I first have to talk about agents. I'll define an agent as an entity that has goals, has a way of sensing the world, and has a way of making changes to the world to achieve its goals. By this definition, the human itself can be considered to be an agent. I have goals, I can sense the world, and I can change the world. So humans are agents. Now, there's a theorem from back in 1970 in control theory that says, every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. Now, the term regulator here is really referring to an agent, and the term system is really referring to the world that that agent is operating in. So the agent, the regulator, is sensing the system, the world, and it's making changes to that world to achieve its goals. That's what a regulator does. So this means that any good agent must have a model of its world. In fact, this theorem goes further than that. It says that it must be a model of the world. This means that there's a one-to-one correspondence between the states of my brain, for example, and the states of the world out there. As the world changes, my brain changes, and vice versa. If I do things in the world, that makes the world change the way I wanted my brain to change it. So we must have a model of world. Now, in addition, if the agent itself is part of that world that he's trying to change, then the agent must also contain a model of itself. And I call this a self model. So here I am, a body standing here in this world. If I'm trying to make changes to the world, I have to take into account my body and where my body is, what my body can do, and what it can't do. So I have to have a model of my body in order to make changes to the world. Now, the question I'm going to address now is, do we live in the world directly, or do we live in our model of the world? Now, humans are good agents, so we must have a model of the world, and we must also have a self-model. And the model of the world includes both the sensory and conceptual models. And the self-model includes the body model and the conceptual models, especially the I, me, my model. That's our conceptual model of ourselves. Now, a body in a world is equivalent to a body model and a model of the world. In fact, that theorem says that there's a one-to-one correspondence between them. So this doesn't help you answer the question of where do we live. However, the I, me, my concept is an abstract concept. It doesn't exist out there in the world. I, me, my only exists inside my conceptual model of the world. Therefore, we do not live in the real world. We live in our conceptual model of the world, and our sensory model of the world that we created with our senses. Now, another question is, therefore we live in our model of the world. Another question is, do we experience the world directly, or do we only experience our model of the world? Colors will help us answer that question. The way that colors work is that the retina of the eye has 3 different kinds of photoreceptors. So you can imagine it's equivalent to having a black and white camera that takes 3 images at the same time, one in red, one in green, and one in blue. So if you take those 3 images and combine them together, that's the information that goes from our retina to the brain. And yet our brain takes those 3 black and white images and produces this. Where did those colors come from? They didn't come from the world. They were constructed in our brain. Evolution decided that these colors will make it more useful for us to survive in our world. We'll be able to tell ripe fruit from not ripe fruit, and identify any of those things easily just by the color that we experience. So these colors only exist in our model of the world. They don't exist out in the real world. Therefore, we do experience only our model of the world. That's all that we experience. In fact, what we experience is not what we perceive. If you're standing at a beach looking at a beautiful sunset, you might see something like this. And if you're looking out at one point on the horizon, you can still take in the entire sunset, and it's really beautiful and in very good detail. However, that's not what our eyes are telling our brain. And the reason for that is that when we're seeing colors like this in daylight, we're only using the cones of our visual system in our retina. And the cones of our visual system are very much concentrated at the fovea, the point where you're looking. When you look at a point, that point right there has a lot of cones in it. The density of cones there is about 20 times the density of the background level of cones throughout the rest of the retina. So when you are looking at, and in addition to that, notice that there's also a blind spot. Now you might say, well, we don't see the blind spot because we have 2 eyes and the blind spots are in different areas. But if you close one eye right now, do you see a blind spot? I don't. So what happens to that blind spot? And in addition, when you're looking at that sunset, the center of vision where you're looking would have good visual acuity. You'd see all the colors there. Around the periphery of that, it would be blurry and it would be kind of washed out because their density of photoreceptors is so much lower. You can do an experiment right now to verify that. If you look at my face right now, you can, hopefully, if you have good vision, you can see that I have eyes, ears, a nose, a mouth. Maybe you can even see my glasses and ears and things like that. Now look away about 45 degrees from me. What do you see? You see a head, I bet. I bet that you see a head, but I bet that you can't see any eyes, ears, nose, mouth, anything like that. That's a demonstration that your peripheral vision has very much less resolution than your central vision. So what we perceive is not what we experience. We experience the whole world in high detail out to the very edges of our vision. At some point it cuts off. My hands are invisible now, but here are my hands right here. I'm sure they're right there. I experience them as being in full view as much as they are right here, but they can't be. We don't have that visual acuity. So this is, again, we are experiencing our model of the world. So we are not a body living in a world. We are a self-model living in a model of the world, and our sensory experiences are of that model of the world. What we experience is more than what we perceive. We do not directly experience the real world. So that's the end of part A, and I'll go on to part B. And I'll start with the main hypothesis of this model, which is that there are 3 agents in the human brain. They're different but interconnected subagents. Animals only have 2 of these agents, and the 3rd agent was added in humans, and that's the agent that caused the living problem that I talked about before. In fact, the thinker is the first agent I'll talk about, and it is that 3rd agent that evolved in humans. Now, the thinker uses the brain's executive function, which uses language, symbols, concepts, and images to solve problems. It's the problem solver. And this was the new, more powerful agent, and it's very comfortable working in the world of concepts. It manipulates concepts like bread and butter. The doer is the ancient one that we share with animals, and it's the agent that actually controls the body, and it also has emotions. So emotions come from the doer, and the doer also has fine control over the entire body. The most compelling evidence for these 2 agents is dual process theory in psychology. Now, dual process theory names their two agents System 1 and System 2, and I basically just renamed them to be doer and thinker. So System 1 corresponds to the doer, and System 2 is the thinker. Dual process theory was popularized by Daniel Kahneman in his 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And in this book, he mostly talked about the biases that the doer can have. The doer is the ancient system, but it doesn't really understand concepts as well as the thinker does. So, for example, the concept of probability is something the doer can't really understand and give you the correct answer about probability questions. But the thinker, if it thinks about it, can. The problem is modern humans are lazy, and they rely on the doer for a lot of their answers when they should be using their thinker instead. So the way they demonstrate this is by giving some undergraduate students a psychology test, with a number of questions that have multiple choice answers. And the doer will give one of the answers, which is the correct answer. The doer will give you the incorrect answer, and the thinker will give you the correct answer. And so they can see how many people were using their doer versus how many people were using their thinker to answer those questions. Another book that popularized this theory is Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. And in this book, Malcolm Gladwell extols the merits of the doer. It turns out that the doer can sometimes come up with the right answer on a hunch. And it turns out after you do a lot of research with your thinker, it was the right answer. But the doer can come up with it quickly. So sometimes the doer is better than the thinker. Now the third agent is required by the good regulator theorem. We've got the thinker and doer, and they need to have a model of the world. And my hypothesis is that it's the experiencer that constructs and supplies the combined sensory and conceptual models of the world to the thinker and the doer. This is required since both the thinker and doer agents can access both the sensory and conceptual world models. For example, a lot of people can think in images, so they can imagine an image here and rotate it around and see how it connects to this image here. That's thinking in images. You're obviously using your sensory system to do that. So the thinker can do visual things using the sensory system. And at the same time, the doer can answer conceptual questions, sometimes wrongly, but it can come up with the answer. That's what the psychology students were doing in dual process theory experiments. So they can both access both systems. And further, the conceptual and sensory systems are really tightly integrated. There isn't any dividing line where you can say everything above here is the concept and everything below here is the sensory system. It's a really continuum of going from visual information to detecting lines, that's a concept, to detecting areas, that's a concept, to detecting objects, that's a concept. So there's concepts all the way up from the raw visual data up to the highest level concept that we have, which is I, me, my. Therefore, I claim that the experiencer is the only source of both the conceptual and sensory worlds that are used by the thinker and the doer. You could imagine that there were two duplicate systems that worked for each agent, but that would be a silly waste of resources. There's one system that creates the model, and it gives it to both agents. So I'll give you a block diagram of these agents. And notice that the experiencer takes all the sensory input. It also takes all of the language input. And this is the way that our conceptual model of the world is built up. We learn it from our parents and from our teachers and from our friends. So we are told about the different concepts in the world. We incorporate that into our model. Our thinker can also think about new concepts, and those new concepts can get incorporated into the model. And that's how we build up our conceptual model of the world. And the sensory model of the world comes directly from our senses. The doer is the agent that controls all the body, and that includes speaking language here. When I'm speaking language here, this is my doer doing it. My thinker doesn't know which vocal cord to put at what pressure to make the words come out of my mouth. That's all done by the doer. The doer is the guy that does all that. Both the thinker and doer are connected up to the experiencer to get the information that they need. And then there are two ways of speaking. I talked about how most of our speech is automatic. The doer just comes up with the words, and they just flow out of us without even thinking about them. But sometimes you have to stop and think about it. And when you stop and think about it, that's when you're using the thinker. An example of that would be adding two two-digit numbers together. You probably have to use your thinker to do it. Your doer probably doesn't know how to do that. Now, in addition to the thinker using thoughtful speech, it also generates the inner voice. And this is the voice that we hear in our heads. And the we that's hearing it is really the experiencer is hearing the thinker talk. So the thinker's talking without going through the mouth, and he's talking to the experiencer. So this is how the new concepts the thinker comes up with can get incorporated into the experiencer's model of the world through that inner voice. The other connections are that the thinker and doer can ask the experiencer to pay attention to a certain area. For example, right now, you're all presumably asking your thinker to pay attention to me in my talk. That's top-down attention. Bottom-up attention would be if there was a loud sound in the room, the experiencer would bring that to your attention in case you had to do something about it. You almost demonstrated loud sound back there. Thank you. So that would be a bottom-up attention, that being brought to your attention so that you can take care of whatever that sound means. Finally, the doer has to tell the experiencer whenever it's going to move the body, because moving the body will change the sensory experience that the body's going to have. So it needs to take that into account. For example, when you move your eyes around in this room here, it doesn't look like the world is jumping, does it? Yet the image on our retina is changing radically when you move your eyes around. However, if you touch your eye like this, it does look like the world is jumping. Because the normal pathway of telling you, hey, I'm going to move my eyes, isn't being satisfied there. So the experiencer thinks, hey, the world is jumping. So for an animal, this diagram would look like this. First of all, they don't have that language input mechanism to build up their really complex model of the world and concepts. Instead, they only have self-generated concepts. And animals do have self-generated concepts. After all, I said there's a continuum on sensory data all the way up. Everything you do with sensory data is generating higher level concepts as you go up through the chain of processing. But some animals have come up with some form of this I, me, my concept. But they don't have the conceptual model of the world that we have. Now, in addition, there's no thoughtful speech that we can detect. And an example that demonstrates this is that chimpanzees, when they find a tree that's full of ripe fruit, they give out a special call, and that brings all their other mates to come to that tree to help share in the abundance of the fruit. Jane Goodall did an experiment where she hid some bananas and waited until a chimpanzee found them. Now, that chimpanzee solved the problem of how do I keep all this fruit for myself? And the way he solved that problem was by putting his hand over his mouth. He couldn't use his thinker to stop himself from saying that automatic speech. He only had automatic speech. He didn't have thoughtful speech. Now, if they don't have thoughtful speech, they probably don't have an inner voice, but we have to ask them, and they haven't answered us so far. Now, remember, an agent needs a self-model if it's part of the world that it's trying to modify. So on that basis, the thinker and the doer definitely need self-models. And the thinker self-model is the very complicated I, me, my concept I've talked about. It also has a simplified body model that it thinks it controls completely. I am in complete control of this body. That's what my thinker is saying. And it's not true, but he thinks that. It also has goals that the thinker made up, such as I must always be right. And if any of you tell me that I'm wrong, I'll let you know why. So the doer self-model is much simpler. It's essentially the full body model. It's the model of the entire body, of what it's capable of, and it knows how to operate that body to achieve whatever goal it wants to achieve. And the doer's goals are indicated by emotions and feelings. Now, at first glance, the experiencer looks like it doesn't need to have a self-model because the experiencer doesn't change the external world. All it's doing is taking information in. It's not doing anything out to the external world. However, the experiencer does pay attention, both top-down and bottom-up attention. And attention changes the internal representation of the world. When you're paying attention to a certain area, you're essentially amplifying that signal for that area so that the thinker and the doer can do something with that area, whatever you're doing. If you're reading a book, you're paying attention to the words of the page so that you can understand what they mean. So directing attention does change the internal world, representation of the world. So in that internal world, there has to be representation of the experiencer. Since paying attention modifies the internal world, the attention state that the experiencer has right now has to be combined with the world model that the experiencer has constructed. The two of those together give you the actual model of the world. And you could say, in a sense, the experiencer is this current state of attention combined with the current state of the world model. You couldn't do any one of those separately. It has to be those two combined is what gives you what the experiencer is. So this leads to the first experiential self-model, which is that the self-model is identical to the world model. Because the world model is not just the state of the world, but it's also where you're paying attention, so you can interpret that model correctly. Now, If the experiencer doesn't have a separate world self-model, you could say that the experiencer has no self-model, because it's no different than the world model. So those are the two different interpretations of the self-model of the experiencer. Now, the human as a whole is an agent, so there's one more self-model that we have to consider, which is the entire human self-model. And how does that self-model change with both time and with spiritual practices? So this is kind of a preview of the whole rest of this talk here, so this slides will give you a lot. I believe that the ancient human self-model would be equal to the doer self-model, which is what essentially animals have. Their self-model is their own body. A normal, modern, non-spiritual human would have the human self-model equal to the thinker self-model. I am my thinker. That's who I think I am. I think I am that little voice in my head. That's who I am. A spiritual modern human would say that the human self-model is less than the thinker self-model. In a sense, they become aware of the doer and the experiencer, which are the bigger part of us. You know, the doer and experiencer do most of the work of living in the world. The thinker takes all the credit, though. The thinker thinks he did it all. So the spiritual modern human realizes that I am not just my thinker, I am something else too. And a spiritually enlightened modern human would actually have their human self-model equal to the experiencer self-model. And I'll explain this enlightened state of consciousness on the next slide. I'll call this kind of human self-model as the experiencer consciousness. Now, the Hindu Advaita Vedanta tradition says that enlightenment is non-dual. This means not two, one, which means that the self and other distinction is an illusion. There isn't really a difference between self and other. In other words, the world and I are one. Now, the first experiential self-model is that the self-model equals the entire whole world model, and therefore experiencer consciousness is non-dual. If you can get into that experiencer consciousness state where you think that you're the experiencer self-model, you would have a non-dual experience. Further, in Buddhism, they talk about anatta, which is the realization that self of any kind is an illusion. There is no self. The second experiential self-model is that there is no self-model. Therefore, anatta is also realized in experiencer consciousness. Now, in some of my other talks that are on YouTube, I talk a lot more about enlightenment. This is all I'm going to talk about here because I only have 45 minutes. So let's talk about agents' goals now. And there are goals that are set by evolution. In fact, for the doer, the goals are to stay alive, avoiding danger and predators, obtain food, water, and shelter, and to reproduce, raise children, and to be social. And humans are intensely social animals, so this is a very strong goal in humans, this pro-social goal. Now, the experiencer goals are much simpler. Well, not simpler. They're just to create a sensory model of the world. This is a very big part of our brain. To direct top-down and bottom-up attention, and to pay attention to the thinker's inner voice and to the doer's emotions. So the thinker's goals is simply to solve problems. Evolution has basically designed the thinker to be a generalized problem solver because it doesn't know what kind of problems are going to be encountered in the world at any given time. So the idea of having a thinker module was to handle whatever problems come up. And it's a good thing because this thinker has been able to handle the conceptual world that we live in right now, which is way, way different than anything that evolution could have imagined. You know, those billions and billions of concepts that we live in is way different than anything that other animals experience. So that's the only goal set by evolution for the thinker, is to solve problems. Now, each agent can create new goals to help meet current goals, and that's one of the most intelligent things an agent can do. For example, to meet my goal of getting a PhD in physics, there were a lot of sub-goals I had to build out there to figure out how to get to that final goal. The thinker and doer can learn goals from each other, so that the thinker can learn to be pro-social from the doer. The doer goals are indicated by emotions and feelings, and most of the doer goals are short-term. The thinker's goals are more long-term and use past experiences to plan for the future. And the thinker can also make up purely conceptual goals, such as, I want to get a PhD in physics, or I must always be right. Let's look at some spiritual virtues and values. And if you look at all the spiritual virtues there, they all will help social interactions go more smoothly. So if we're a social animal, using spiritual virtues is a good thing. The spiritual vices all tend to be self-centered and antisocial. So those are going to work against our pro-social goals that we have. So the pro-social goals of the doer are strong, and that makes the doer more likely to practice spiritual virtues. But the doer's self-model is the body. So if the body is threatened, the doer will do whatever is necessary to protect it. And that could include engaging in spiritual vices, stealing, or whatever else it's going to do to protect that body. Now, the thinker can copy the doer's pro-social goals, so the thinker can also have spiritual virtues, practice spiritual virtues. But the thinker is more likely to be self-centered. In fact, the I, me, my concept is basically the definition of self-centeredness. Further, the I, me, my is easily threatened by just words. For example, somebody telling me that I'm wrong. That's threatening to me. I've got to defend myself against that and argue with them, get angry at them, whatever. So the thinker is more likely to get involved in spiritual vices by trying to protect its I, me, my. So the doer's pro-social goals are the basic source of spiritual virtues in the world. That ends part B, and how am I doing on time? Okay, I got time, good. So now I'm going to go on to the problem that spirituality fixes. And as I think you might have figured out, the problem is the thinker. No, not that thinker, it's the thinker agent, otherwise known as the ego. So the thinker is ideal for our civilization, but it's not good at living a happy life. The thinker finds problems everywhere, and that can lead to a negative critical attitude towards life. You've probably met somebody like that has that negative critical attitude. That's his thinker finding problems everywhere. If there is no problem, then that's a problem. I got to solve that problem. I don't have a problem to work on. So I'll go looking in the past for some problem to solve, or I'll invent a new problem right here on the spot. Problems can be in the past, and that's usually called a resentment, where I'm trying to fix what that guy did to me. That's a resentment that I'm holding about that guy. Problems can be in the future, and that usually trigger fears, like, oh my gosh, what if all my investments go to zero? How am I going to live in my retirement? Now, thinkers almost always rehashing and rehearsing. For example, it's having conversations with people who are not in the room. People in the past that it had a conversation with, and it's redoing that conversation and figuring out what they wish they had said at that time, or figuring out when I meet that person in the future, what am I going to tell them? Thus, the thinker is the time traveler. It's always going to the past or the future. It's hardly ever in the present, but when it is in the present, it usually complains about the present. The thinker argues with reality. This should not happen. This is bad and wrong. I should not have done that. This leads to an experience or model of the world that's filled with contradictions. The sensory model will say this thing happened. The conceptual model will say this thing should not have happened. Negative emotions are a problem. How do I prevent this from happening again? Positive emotions are also a problem. How do I make sure that this happens all the time? And notice that the thinker can change a positive emotion into a negative emotion. You know, my wife loves me. Oh, but what'll happen if she leaves me? You know, then it goes into fear and anger and all that. Thus, the thinker is an emotion amplifier and an emotional echo chamber that's kind of running all the time. You know, that inner voice is just commenting on this and that and the other thing and stirring up emotions. Buddhism says that the cause of suffering is attachments and aversions, and the thinker essentially also amplifies and echoes attachments and aversions. If we didn't have a thinker, we would be much less attached or averse to what's happening in our world. Now, the cause of the problem is that the typical non-spiritual modern human completely identifies as the thinker self-model. So that human self-model that I have, that's equal to the thinker self-model. And the reason this happens is that the thinker's inner voice is continually bombarding the experiencer with statements equivalent to, I am, I mean my, and I am in complete control of the body. It's telling the experiencer that's who I am. And the experiencer eventually believes that and updates the human's overall self-model to equal the thinker self-model. Well, that's one thing I forgot to mention in the diagram of the experiencer. The experiencer has the conceptual model of the world, the sensory model of the world, and all of the self-models. It has the self-model of the thinker, the self-model of the doer, and the self-model of the experiencer, and the self-model of the human as a whole. They're all contained in that experiencer model of the world and body and self. So the experiencer can update that human self-model and make it equal to the thinker self-model, if you're thinking in terms of a programmer. Now, This makes it harder for the doer's pro-social goals to be expressed, since the doer's goals are now subordinated to the thinker's goals. So the thinker's goal of always being right wins when somebody says I'm wrong. By the way, you can tell that I've got a thing about that, right? So it wins, and it cuts out the pro-social goals of the experiencer, of the doer, which would be to say, oh, that's interesting, Instead, I go on the attack. So and it also makes the thinker's inner voice very important, since that's me talking. So I got to pay attention to me, because that's me. I got to be right. I must be believed and obeyed. It would be much better if the experiencer and doer treated the inner voice as a suggestion to be considered, not a command to be obeyed. The goal of spirituality is to undo the problems that this thinker-self model identification creates. So that's to reduce identification with the thinker I, me, my. So I'm not really I, me, my, there's something else to me. Diminish the thinker's selfishness and self-centeredness, get more into the doer's pro-social goals, and reduce the thinker's judgments and criticisms. In particular, make the thinker more pro-social, love one another, to practice the spiritual virtues instead of the vices. Now, theistic spirituality also asks the thinker to surrender to God. In a preview, we will see that God is really the experiencer. So let's look at the non-theistic spiritual traditions first. When the thinker first became conscious, this increase in suffering could have been noticed by the experiencer and would have been more apparent. And these traditions are trying to undo that increase in suffering that was noticed that when the thinker became the conscious agent, the one that we think we are. We think we are the thinker. Now, some of these paths also have enlightened states, and in that state, the thinker's suffering can be completely undone, because that little box that says human self-model equals thinker self-model has been changed to human self-model equals experiencer self-model. So we aren't the thinker at all anymore. So the thinker is not going to affect the way that we experience world. In that state, there's no identification with the thinker. Now, continuing on with the theistic spiritual traditions, what is God in this model? Well, again, when the thinker first became conscious, a weaker thinker could have experienced a stronger agent with more power in the world than it had. In particular, the doer could have made the human do things that the thinker didn't think they should do. So that could be, me feeling like, hey, there's somebody more powerful than me controlling me. Thus, the doer or experiencer could have become identified as God to this early thinker. And the experiencer is actually the best candidate for God, because remember, the experiencer creates the world where the thinker self-models lives. That includes not only the sensory world model, but also the conceptual world model. Those are all created and contained inside the experiencer, and the experiencer is presenting that model. That world that the experiencer creates is the world that the thinker lives in. He lives in that world. Further, intuition comes from the experiencer, and intuition is often said to be the channel that God uses to answer prayer. I forgot to mention that, back again at that block diagram, the experiencer is a source of intuition. And my definition of intuition is understanding how the world works without thinking. So that's intuition. On the other hand, my definition of instinct is that instinct is understanding what to do in the world without thinking. That's what the doer does. It knows what to do in the world without thinking. The experiencer knows the way the world works without thinking about it. So that's what intuition and instinct come from. And intuition comes from the experiencer. And a lot of religious paths talk about intuition as being God's conduit to us. And finally, I believe that the experiencer can be even more help to humans by modifying its attention mechanism. For example, someone who's trying to stop smoking cigarettes. Would it be a good thing for you if your experiencer just paid less attention to cigarettes? Like when you see a cigarette, you don't think about it. Or when you think about smoking, if the experiencer doesn't pay attention to that thought and it doesn't get amplified, wouldn't that be a useful thing? So this is something I think can happen with the experiencer. It can be useful to us to help us change the world and change the way that we live in the world. Now, almost all spiritual traditions use meditation of one form or another. And I won't go into all the individual kinds of meditation here, but they all are attempts to quiet the thinker's inner voice. And if we can quiet the thinker's inner voice, we can get in touch with the fact that we're more than just the thinker. we're that doer and that experiencer at the same time. Especially bottom-up meditation that pay attention to experiences that come to the attention, that's noticing the experiencer doing its bottom-up attention mechanism. And so all this makes it easier to notice that the doer and thinker are other agents, and to reduce the identification of the thinker. We won't think that we're just the thinker if we get into a good meditation practice. Now, how do other spiritual practices help solve the thinker problem? Well, surrender is the thinker giving up his illusion of control. Remember, he only has an illusion. He thinks he does everything, but he doesn't. So if he gives up that illusion of control, that's surrender. And the thinker can use prayer to ask for help from the doer and experiencer. Living in the now is what the experiencer does always. It's always living in the now. But the thinker is often off in the past or future, so if you can get into living in the now, you can get out of the thinker and into the experiencer. Forgiveness and acceptance can mitigate resentments caused by the thinker trying to solve problems in the past. My favorite saying about forgiveness is that forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. So as long as the thinker is trying to solve that problem in the past that happened, it's going to hold on to that resentment. If you can give up all hope of trying to solve that problem in the past and accepting exactly the way it is, that's when I can let go of the resentment and I can forgive the person that hurt me. Now, Krishnamurti was asked, what's your secret? Krishnamurti was supposedly an enlightened person, and somebody asked him, what's your secret? His answer was, you see, I don't mind what happens. And that's exactly what the experiencer does. The experiencer doesn't mind what happens. It doesn't mind what happens in the physical world here. It just records it and builds up the model it has in the world to duplicate whatever actually did happen in the world. It also doesn't mind what happens in the conceptual world. It doesn't feel threatened by any complaint or criticism. It just accepts that information in. It tries to incorporate it into the conceptual model of the world. If it can incorporate it into the conceptual model of the world, that means it understands it and takes that information in. If it can't incorporate it, if it's nonsense, it just ignores it because it's just nonsense. So if it can make sense out of it and make it and incorporate it into the model of the world, it does. If it can't, it just ignores it. But it's not minding about what happens. It's not complaining or anything like that. Finally, trusting in a higher power can also help mitigate fear caused by the thinker trying to solve problems in the future. If I can just trust that everything's going to be okay, I won't have to live in fear. And finally, gratitude is the antidote to the thinker's many complaints. If we can live in a world of gratitude, that's quieting down those thinker's complaints that he comes up with all the time. Now, another question is, can this model explain some Bible passages? And I think it can. For example, in Genesis, God brought all the animals and birds to Adam so he could name them. This is the experiencer allowing the thinker to generate nouns. In Eden, when they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, this is describing when we began to live in that conceptual world, back in that behavioral modernity time. This is when the human self-model became equal to the thinker self-model. So until that time, we were living in paradise, and that's what Eden is usually described as. There were no suffering, everything was beautiful, we got along with everybody, we were living in paradise. Then we took the bite of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's exactly what the thinker decides. This is good, this is bad, this should happen, this shouldn't happen. When we started living in that world of the thinker, that's when we started suffering. That's when we were cast out of Eden. That's when we had to wear clothes and all the other things they claim, that all the other suffering that we got. And finally, Jesus said, the Father and I are one. This could mean that his thinker has surrendered to the doer and or experiencer, or it could mean that Jesus was living in that experiencer enlightened state, in one of those two things. So this is the end of part C, and I'd like to thank you for directing your top-down attention to my presentation. And I hope that your experiencer intuitively understood the three-agent model of consciousness, and that this model has explained the origin, purpose, and efficacy of spirituality. And please check out my website and my Facebook page. And if you'd like to get a copy of these foils, I left my business card on the table back there. Pick up the business card, send me an email. I'll send you a copy of all these foils so you don't have to try to remember what I said. So are there any questions?
I'll pass the microphone around, so raise your hands if you want to ask a question. Because there are so many people, try to keep your questions brief. Okay.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful, educational talk. Learned a lot. And I think so far as you go, I don't dispute any of it, except maybe some people, however, I guess I would say, some people have a definition of spirituality that maybe goes, including me, I think, that goes beyond the way you're describing it. For example, so you're talking about us living in a model of reality, right? And there's actually reality out there, which is not what we're experiencing, not where the thinker lives, where the experiencer lives, where the doer lives.
Right.
There is presumably a reality that's creating that model of reality somewhere in our brain, if you believe it's in our brain, which I probably do. Some people don't, but it's still in reality. So there is a reality, presumably, that's creating everything that we live in this model of the world that is beyond our understanding by definition. If we understood that reality, that spirit, that whatever that world is as the spiritual world, then it would exist in our model and it would be created by a broader reality that's creating it that we don't understand. So in my mind, spirituality lives in that which is sort of beyond understanding, which the mystery that's beyond understanding, and by definition, by defining it, you're sort of contradicting the meaning of the word.
Okay. Well, I'm a physicist, so I definitely believe there is a reality out there. And the way I look at it is all of our physics models that we come up with, quantum mechanics, general relativity, all those things, are just models of reality. They don't describe the actual reality that's underneath there. Even according to our best model of reality right now, what this world is an infinite dimensional Hilbert space. That's what quantum mechanics works with. And that is not anything like what we experience here. So, and who knows what's behind that infinite dimensional Hilbert space? So even that is just a model, and there might be further research that we have to do, and maybe we can get closer and closer to it. And I think you may be right that we can never actually determine the exact nature of reality down to the last decimal point. But we're just creating better and better models along the way, and that's the way I look at it. That's the way I would reconcile your view and my view.
Thank you very much for your talk. Do you think free will and the fixation with this concept is centered around the thinker maybe trying to say,
yes,
don't forget me.
If I want
to be happy, keep me around.
If I had more time, I could give you a talk about free will. I haven't actually written it down yet, but in my head, my talk about free will would go like this. Free will is conflating I, me, my with reality. When somebody says, I have free will, they mean, I, me, my has free will. Well, I, me, my is a concept in my conceptual model of the world. A concept doesn't have free will. It's just something that exists in my model of the world. It has connections to other concepts in the world. The agent that has free will is the doer. There's experiments by Libet's decision delay experiments. I don't know if people are familiar with that. But he hooked up electrodes onto a person's brain, and he gave them the instruction, whenever you want to, press this button. And at the same time, they were supposed to pay attention to this rapidly rotating second hand and notice where on the dial was the second hand when they made the decision to press the button. So it turns out that the electrodes on the brain could detect that they were about to press the button 100 to 200 milliseconds before they became aware that they pressed the button. The doer is the one that decided to press the button. It took the thinker 100 to 200 milliseconds to notice that the doer decided to press the button, and then the thinker took credit for it. I decided to press the button right then. So this is the source of the illusion of free will. We think that we are making all of our decisions. And we think that we is the I, me, my concept. I, me, my concepts can't make decisions. They're just a concept. That's all they are. They don't make decisions. That's not our function. Agents make decisions. The doer makes decisions. The thinker can also make decisions. I can make a conscious thought of, I'm going to go eat ice cream. And sure enough, you'll find that I eventually go and eat ice cream. I can make decisions like that. But that doesn't mean that they're free will. They didn't come from the I, me, my concept. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Actually, I've read a lot of Sanskrit texts on Advaita, and I think you mapped your models on Manas, Chitta, and Buddhi. Is that true? Or
say again?
The terms Manas being the doer, Chitta means experience, and Buddhi the thinker? Or You haven't.
I guess I'm not that familiar with those concepts.
Okay, 'cause
Yeah, come up and tell me,
this-
give me a reference for that. I'll study
This
about
comes
that.
from the Advaita text. It's all over the world. So, I mean, all over the text.
Okay.
So this is very interesting because especially the manas being the volition, the doer being the volition. So,
I never actually studied that. I only listened to people who studied it.
this is so good. It's very well explained. So I've requested. Thank you so much. I mean, my thinking is, so I was wondering, I did it map, but you explained it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Back there,
Okay.
right here.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I read an article once that talked about the neural networks in the brain and how they actually stimulated parts of the brain that made the person have a religious experience. You know, they felt that God or somebody was next to them.
Yes.
So to the extent in which, I mean, you're talking more in terms of, you know, like the conceptual model of, you know, maybe how the brain works, but maybe it is more fundamental in actually how the neural networks of the brain are set up. So I just wanted to...
It could be. I know there's the God helmet. That's where they do some magnetic field zapping of parts of the brain, and that gets sometimes for some people can give you a you know, that spiritual experience of something else exists. I kind of don't really pay that much attention to those things because you're basically taking a very complicated computer and shaking it, and oh, it's acting differently now. You know, maybe that same circuit that they're zapping when they're doing that thing. Maybe that's what happens when you do convert to that experience or consciousness state. Maybe that circuit gets activated then. But the way that they're doing it with magnetic stimulation of the brain, I don't think that tells you very much. You're zapping millions and billions of neurons at the same time there. That's not the way that the brain normally operates.
Randy, you have a question?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, there's a question up here.
Well,
Wait for the mic.
yeah, I like your analysis. Very good
Wait.
analysis.
Supposed to wait for the mic.
What?
You're supposed to wait for the mic.
Oh, wait for the mic.
Otherwise, the world won't remember what you
Okay,
said.
all right.
And then we have another question over here.
Well, I like your analysis very well, but I don't want to hurt your feelings.
That's okay. You can
First
tell me I'm
off-
wrong.
I look at the daily paper and the TV, and I think the brain has a long way to go, period. Now, you want to keep, now I think we're impossible, if you must know. And we are here only by a cosmic fluke, period.
Could be.
If it weren't for this boloid hitting the planet 66 million years ago, we probably would not be here, period. And that would be good news, but it's too late. So, but I admire your hope.
Great.
Frankly, I don't have any.
That's okay. I'll be all the frank that you need.
Hi. I had a sort of a simpler concept of spirituality that I just run by you real quick and see what you think of it. Is that evolution created taste? You know, that's not a coincidence that things that taste good tend to be good for us, and things that taste bad tend to be bad for us. And I think that emotions are sort of like taste for behavior. And I was wondering if you think that there's a correspondence that when we do the right thing, we feel good, and when we do the wrong thing, we think we feel bad, because if you get that mixed up, those people are not our ancestors anymore.
Yeah, I think a lot of emotions come from those pro-social goals. You know, if you're pro-social, you're going to love and forgive and accept and all those kinds of things. So to keep society moving smoothly socially, we do the spiritual virtues, and those are associated with the emotions. The doer's goals and the doer's emotions are definitely very closely related to each other. Yes.
It sounds as though you're describing the thinker as needing problems and also causing us problems. And it almost sounds like there's a parallel between your definition of a thinker and the biblical concept of Satan or the devil. The devil made me do it. And I don't know, I find that interesting. Maybe you can comment on that.
You know, I hadn't thought about that before, but, you know, on first blush, it does sound interesting. It sounds like a lot of the problems that the thinker is causing are the kinds of problems that Satan would cause for us. So, yeah.
Another
Could be.
interesting thing, in religion, they might call it Satan. I don't know if you've read any Eckhart Tolle. He
Oh, yeah.
calls it the ego, which
Yes.
really is the same thing.
The ego is the thinker. I think I had that on one slide. The thinker equals the ego. Yes.
Yeah, but it's not the Freudian ego.
No, it's not the
a little
Freudian
different.
ego.
It's
It
a
is
little
different.
But also, he says, because we need the thinker in this world.
Without the thinker, we wouldn't have this world.
Right, exactly.
We'd be living like chimpanzees.
And he says take the thinker out as a toolbox, out of your toolbox when you need it,
Yes,
and then put it away because it's going to mess you up.
that's right. I agree entirely.
That's what anybody wants control over you want.
Can you,
I had a couple of things. One was, it said that the chimpanzees in the wild only have 30 symbols. Can they have more if
Well-
they spend time around humans?
yeah, there have been experiments where people have tried to teach chimpanzees language. Now, their vocal cords can't actually produce words the way we do, but they can do sign language or they can press symbols on a computer. So they do have a pretty good brain, but, you know, it takes a lot of training to train them to get new symbols. You can train an infant a new word in 10 seconds or 10 minutes, you know. The human brain is just way more trainable for symbols than chimpanzees' brains are.
And also, there's the fact that humans, we have the I am right, and we also have the experiencer that can see new things and come up with new ideas. But what is it that causes people to be so attached to an idea that they had before, right? Once somebody has decided, you know, what God said it, I believe it, that settles it, and any evidence they get to the contrary is just automatically tossed in the trash, and I'm not sure what part of...
I think part of that can come from the I, me, my feeling threatened. If somebody's saying that their idea of God is wrong, the I, me, my will feel threatened, and it will then instruct the experiencer, ignore what that person said, they're wrong, the right thing is that God is according to the Bible this or whatever. And so I think it all comes down to the thinker feeling threatened and fighting against the new idea.
Mitigate that.
How do we mitigate that? By using spiritual practices and get out of thinking that you're the thinker. These people would have to become more spiritual instead of religious.
Well, that's all the time we have, so thanks for the speaker. Thanks.